The Spanish-American War, the conflict that changed America forever. Cuba's revolution and the road to war. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your country has declared war because of a single explosion. Within just a few months, an aging European empire would collapse. The United States would emerge as a global power, and the map of the world would change forever. The war lasted only 114 days, but its consequences would shape the next century. It transformed America from a nation focused mostly on its own continent into a country with overseas territories, a powerful navy, and ambitions that reached far beyond its borders. Yet the biggest question remains: did America go to war to free Cuba or to build an empire of its own? This is the story of the Spanish-American War, a conflict that forever changed the balance of global power. Chapter 1. An Empire in Decline. By the late 1800s, Spain was no longer the mighty empire that had once ruled much of the Americas. 3 centuries earlier, Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic carrying soldiers, settlers, and missionaries. At its peak, Spain controlled territories stretching from South America to North America, across the Caribbean, and deep into the Pacific. But by 1898, that empire was falling apart. Most of Spain's American colonies had already won their independence decades earlier. Only a handful remained. Among them, none was more valuable than Cuba. Located just 90 miles from Florida, Cuba was one of Spain's richest possessions. Its sugar plantations generated enormous wealth, making the island essential to Spain's struggling economy. For many Cubans, however, Spanish rule had become unbearable. Heavy taxes, political repression, and limited freedoms fueled growing anger. The dream of independence became stronger with each passing year. The first major uprising, known as the 10 Years' War, began in 1868. Cuban revolutionaries fought fiercely against Spanish forces, hoping to secure their freedom. After 10 years of brutal fighting, the rebellion failed. Spain remained in control, but the desire for independence never disappeared. Instead, it grew stronger. Chapter 2. Cuba rises again. In 1895, revolution returned. This time, Cuban nationalists were better organized and more determined than ever. Leading intellectuals like José Martí inspired thousands to fight for a free Cuba, believing that independence was worth any sacrifice. Spain answered with overwhelming force. General Valeriano Weyler was sent to crush the rebellion once and for all. His strategy became infamous. Entire rural communities were forced into guarded camps so that rebels could no longer receive food or shelter from civilians. The policy became known as reconcentration. Conditions inside these camps were catastrophic. Food was scarce. Disease spread rapidly. Families were separated. Thousands of civilians, including women and children, died from starvation and illness rather than combat. Reports of these horrors soon crossed the Atlantic. American newspapers published dramatic stories describing Spain's actions in shocking detail. Some reports were accurate, others were exaggerated, but together they created something incredibly powerful. Public outrage. Chapter 3. The newspapers that helped start a war. In the late 19th century, newspapers competed fiercely for readers. Publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer discovered that dramatic headlines sold far more papers than ordinary reporting. Stories about Cuban suffering appeared almost daily. Illustrations showed starving families, burning villages, brutal Spanish soldiers. Many Americans had never even seen Cuba. Yet millions suddenly felt emotionally connected to its struggle. This style of sensational reporting became known as yellow journalism. Whether every story was completely true mattered less than how readers felt after seeing the headlines. Each new article increased public pressure on Washington. More Americans began asking the same question. How long could the United States remain on the sidelines, while people suffered only a short distance from its shores? Still, President William McKinley hesitated. He understood that war carried enormous risks. Diplomacy, he believed, should always come before military action. But events were moving faster than anyone could control. Chapter 4. America watches closely. The United States had more than humanitarian reasons for paying attention. American businesses had invested millions of dollars in Cuba's sugar industry. Trade between the two countries was booming. If the conflict continued, those investments and regional stability were at risk. Military leaders also recognized Cuba's strategic location. An island so close to the American coastline could influence security throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, political pressure inside the United States continued to build. Newspapers demanded action. Politicians debated intervention. Ordinary citizens organized rallies supporting Cuban independence. Although President McKinley still hoped Spain and the Cuban rebels could negotiate peace, each passing week made neutrality more difficult. Then, another event pushed the crisis even closer to the edge. In February 1898, Spain's ambassador became the center of a diplomatic scandal after a private letter criticizing President McKinley was leaked to the American press. The letter insulted the president and questioned his leadership. Americans were furious. Relations between Washington and Madrid deteriorated almost overnight. Yet even after the controversy, few imagined that within days, a single explosion would change everything. An explosion that would ignite one of the most consequential wars in American history. The USS Maine, America's Declaration of War and the First Victories, Chapter 5. The explosion that changed everything. On the evening of February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine sat quietly in Havana Harbor. The ship had arrived only weeks earlier on what the United States described as a peaceful mission. Its purpose was to protect American citizens and interests, while tensions in Cuba continued to rise. Nothing seemed unusual. Crew members finished dinner, cleaned their stations, and prepared for another ordinary night. Then, at exactly 9:40 p.m., everything changed. A tremendous explosion ripped through the forward section of the ship. The blast was so powerful that it lifted thousands of tons of steel into the air before the vessel began sinking into the harbor. Within minutes, the pride of the U.S. Navy had become a twisted wreck. More than 260 American sailors lost their lives. The harbor echoed with screams, smoke, and chaos as survivors searched desperately for their friends in the darkness. No one knew what had caused the explosion, but the American public quickly decided who was responsible. Chapter 6. Remember the Maine. Before investigators could determine the cause, newspapers had already reached their own conclusion. Spain was blamed almost immediately. Across the United States, bold headlines demanded revenge. Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. The slogan spread from newspapers to political speeches, public rallies, and city streets. For many Americans, the explosion wasn't simply a naval disaster. It was viewed as a direct attack on the United States. The truth, however, was far less certain. A U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry concluded that an external mine had likely caused the blast, but stopped short of accusing Spain directly. Decades later, modern investigations suggested that an internal coal bunker fire may have triggered the explosion instead. Even today, historians continue to debate the ship's destruction. But in 1898, facts mattered less than public emotion. The explosion had become the spark that ignited a nation. Chapter 7. President McKinley's decision. President William McKinley understood the enormous consequences of war. He had served as a soldier during the American Civil War and had witnessed its horrors firsthand. Unlike many politicians demanding immediate action, McKinley desperately hoped diplomacy could still prevent another conflict. He gave Spain one final opportunity. American officials demanded an end to the brutal reconcentration camps and called for reforms that would grant Cuba greater independence. Spain responded by recalling General Weyler and offering limited concessions. But by then, the political damage had already been done. Congress faced overwhelming pressure from voters. Editorials demanded action. Massive public demonstrations filled American cities. The country wanted answers, and increasingly, it wanted war. On April 25, 1898, Congress officially declared that a state of war existed between the United States and Spain. The Spanish-American War had begun. Yet before the first major battle, the United States made an important promise. Through the Teller Amendment, Congress declared that America had no intention of permanently controlling Cuba. Its stated goal, lawmakers insisted, was to help Cubans achieve their independence, not to claim the island for itself. Whether that promise would survive the realities of war remained to be seen. Chapter 8. America Strikes. First, many Americans expected the fighting to begin in Cuba. Instead, the first major battle took place nearly 8,000 miles away in the Philippines. Long before Congress officially declared war, Commodore George Dewey had quietly received secret orders. If war became inevitable, he was to sail into Manila Bay and destroy Spain's Pacific Fleet before it could threaten American interests. On the night of April 30th, Dewey's squadron entered Manila Bay under the cover of darkness. The operation was incredibly risky. Spanish coastal batteries guarded the entrance. One mistake could have trapped the American fleet inside the harbor. Yet the ships slipped through almost unnoticed. As dawn broke on May 1st, the American warships moved into position. Standing aboard his flagship, Dewey calmly gave one of the most famous orders in U.S. naval history. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Moments later, American guns erupted. The thunder of naval artillery echoed across Manila Bay. Chapter 9. The Battle of Manila Bay. The battle quickly became one of the most one-sided naval victories in modern history. American shells struck Spanish cruisers with devastating accuracy. Ship after ship caught fire. Explosions tore through wooden decks and ammunition magazines. Spanish sailors fought courageously, but were hopelessly outmatched. Within hours, nearly the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet had been destroyed. The most astonishing part of the battle wasn't how long it lasted. It was how few American casualties there were. The victory stunned military observers around the world. For decades, European nations had viewed the United States as a regional power with limited global influence. Now they were watching an American Navy destroy one of Europe's oldest empires in a single morning. News of Dewey's victory spread across the United States almost instantly. Church bells rang. Crowds celebrated in city streets. George Dewey became a national hero overnight. But despite the overwhelming naval success, one important problem remained. Destroying Spain's fleet did not automatically give America control of the Philippines. Thousands of Spanish soldiers still occupied Manila, and Filipino revolutionaries, who had been fighting Spain for years, expected independence, not another foreign power. The conflict was becoming far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Cuba, San Juan Hill, and the birth of an American superpower. Chapter 10. The war reaches Cuba. While Commodore George Dewey's stunning victory at Manila Bay dominated headlines, the true heart of the war remained where it had begun, Cuba. To defeat Spain, the United States needed to capture the island's most important military positions. But Cuba's dense jungles, rugged hills, and tropical climate would prove just as dangerous as the Spanish army itself. In early June 1898, American Marines landed near Guantanamo Bay. Waiting for them were thousands of Spanish troops who knew the terrain far better than the invaders. Although heavily outnumbered, the Marines pushed inland with the support of Cuban rebels, who had spent years fighting Spanish forces. Together, they launched attacks on Spanish defensive positions, while American warships bombarded enemy fortifications from offshore. After several days of fierce fighting, Spanish resistance began to collapse. By June 10th, the United States had secured Guantanamo Bay. It was America's first major victory on Cuban soil, and it gave the Navy a vital base for the campaign ahead. But the toughest battle was still waiting. Chapter 11. The road to Santiago. The next objective was Santiago de Cuba, Spain's strongest military base in the Caribbean. Capturing the city would trap the Spanish fleet and cripple Spain's ability to continue the war. Thousands of American soldiers landed east of Santiago and immediately faced an enemy they hadn't expected. Not just Spanish bullets, but unbearable heat. Mosquitoes swarmed through the camps. Food and clean water became scarce. Many soldiers suffered from malaria, yellow fever, and exhaustion before they ever fired a shot. Still, the advance continued. General William Shafter ordered his army toward a series of heavily defended hills protecting Santiago. If those heights could be captured, the city itself would soon fall. Chapter 12. The charge that became a legend. Officially known as the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders were unlike any regiment America had ever assembled. They included cowboys from the American West, college athletes, hunters, ranchers, lawmen, and former soldiers. Leading them was Colonel Leonard Wood, while the regiment's second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, quickly became its most famous face. Ironically, despite being a cavalry unit, most of their horses never reached Cuba. The men fought on foot. On July 1, 1898, American forces began advancing toward Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill under relentless Spanish rifle fire. Bullets tore through tall grass as soldiers struggled uphill across open ground with little cover. For a moment, the advance slowed. Then Roosevelt refused to stop. Drawing his revolver, he surged forward, shouting for his men to follow. Inspired by his determination, the Rough Riders, joined by the experienced black cavalrymen of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, charged uphill together. The fighting was chaotic. Smoke filled the air. Machine gun fire echoed across the hillside. One by one, American soldiers reached the Spanish trenches. After brutal close-range fighting, the defenders finally withdrew. The Stars and Stripes flew over Kettle Hill. Soon afterward, San Juan Hill also fell into American hands. The victory came at a heavy price. Hundreds of Americans had been killed or wounded. But strategically, the battle changed everything. American artillery now overlooked Santiago. Spain's position had become almost impossible to defend. Chapter 13. Spain's last gamble. With Santiago surrounded, Spain faced an impossible choice: remain trapped inside the harbor or attempt a desperate escape. On the morning of July 3, 1898, Admiral Pascual Cervera made his decision. One by one, Spanish warships steamed out of Santiago Harbor. Waiting just beyond the entrance was the U.S. Navy. American battleships immediately opened fire. Massive shells slammed into the Spanish vessels. Explosions ripped through steel hulls. Several ships burst into flames. Others ran aground to avoid sinking. Within only a few hours, Spain's Caribbean fleet had been almost completely destroyed. The defeat was catastrophic. Without naval support, Santiago could no longer hold. Just 2 weeks later, the city surrendered. By midsummer, it had become clear to both governments that the war was effectively over. Chapter 14. A new American empire. Peace negotiations began later that year in Paris. On December 10, 1898, representatives from both nations signed the Treaty of Paris. The agreement officially ended the Spanish-American War. Spain gave up its claim to Cuba. It also transferred Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. In return, America agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines. The treaty marked the end of Spain's centuries-long colonial empire. For the United States, however, it marked a beginning. For the first time in its history, America possessed overseas territories stretching across both the Caribbean and the Pacific. The nation had become a global power, yet victory also raised uncomfortable questions. If America had fought in the name of freedom, why was it now governing distant territories itself? The debate over imperialism divided politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Some believed the United States had a moral duty to spread democracy. Others argued that controlling foreign lands betrayed the very principles on which America had been founded. Those questions would continue for decades. Conclusion: a war that changed the world. The Spanish-American War lasted only 114 days. Compared with other conflicts, it was remarkably short. But its consequences were enormous. Spain's empire, once one of the greatest in history, collapsed almost overnight. The United States emerged as a dominant military and naval power, with influence reaching far beyond North America. It was a turning point that reshaped global politics and set America on the path toward becoming one of the world's leading superpowers during the 20th century. Yet perhaps the war's greatest legacy is the question it still leaves behind. Was this a war fought to liberate oppressed people? Or was it the moment America began building an empire of its own? The answer depends on whose history you choose to tell. And more than a century later, historians are still debating it, because sometimes the shortest